All right, so today's lesson is entitled Promising Peace, and it comes out of Zechariah. So, does anyone know who Zechariah is? How about Steve? Do you know who Zechariah is, Steve? You're muted, Steve.
All right, Zechariah was a prophet, and I forget whether he was the Southern Kingdom. He was a prophet to Israel, I believe. He was the son of Iddo. That's right. I forget.
I actually think it's the grandson of Iddo.
Okay.
But yes, there is an Iddo. There's a good name there, Steve.
Oh, yeah. During the exile.
Yeah. It was the grandson of Iddo.
All these fun names.
Really?
Yeah. He was, someone said something about the exile. He was born in the exile in Babylon. Zechariah is one of these minor prophets, and my understanding, the way the International Sunday School lesson works is that they do a survey of the Bible every 7 years, and so this is the time that they come back to the minor prophets. And I remember, I guess it's 7 years ago, that I had taught on Amos and some of these other minor prophets. It's kind of fun coming back around, and you kind of forget who some of these characters are here in the Bible, and when they were prophesying, what they were doing in prophesying and all that. So I think it's kind of fun that we get back into looking here at the minor prophets. In my Bible, you turn a couple pages and you're in Matthew, and so it's towards the end of the Old Testament here is where these minor prophets are located. He was a priest, so he was in this priestly family, and one of the things, and maybe someday I'll dive in a little bit deeper with that, but it's just interesting how the Jewish people, when they were in exile, how they went about doing their thing, like with the priests and the sacrifice and the offerings and all that. Not exactly 100% sure how that all worked, but he was a priest. He was born in Babylon, and then he becomes one of the groups to come back to into Judah. So Judah is where Jerusalem is located at. So he's part of the group that comes back into Judah, and then he starts prophesying. And so this is a post-exile prophecy time that he's doing. He's a contemporary of Haggai, and Haggai is the book right before Zechariah here. Haggai, I believe, is only 2 chapters long, but he's a contemporary of Haggai. So Haggai and Zechariah are both prophesying here at the same time. And just to set the tone of what's happening here, you can read back in Ezra and Nehemiah of what happens when they first come back into to Jerusalem. The remnant comes back into Jerusalem. But one of the issues that comes about here is that they are losing their motivation to continue on. There's a lot of issues happening all around them. Some interesting stories there from Nehemiah of how his adversaries try to goad him out of the wall and all that other stuff. And so, in rebuilding the wall, there was issues. In rebuilding the temple, there's issues. The land's not producing like it should. And there are some reasons for that we'll look at here, but that's what's happening. And so Zechariah and Haggai come back both and start prophesying to try and encourage the remnant that came back here into Jerusalem to continue on and not to lose heart, not to be discouraged. And so that's what we're going to be looking at here in Zechariah 8 in the context lens of justice and peace. And so that's kind of sets the stage for what we'll be studying here today. So to start off, yeah.
Hey, Ryan.
Yes.
So Zechariah's prophecy happened when? Like during Nehemiah's time, or after Nehemiah was building the wall, or when?
So I think the wall is already built. So I'm not 100% sure if Zechariah is if he is after. So he would have been coming back with Nehemiah. So it'd been about the same time. I think the wall is built. I think it's in that stage between the wall, like the temple's not rebuilt yet.
They were,
So it's
they
in
were,
that
sta-
it's in
they
that
were
stage,
starting
yeah.
to rebuild the temple. You could see the genealogy in Ezra 7. The
In
beginning
Ezra
of
7.
Ezra 7 is the genealogy, and Zechariah is right there.
Gotcha.
Zebula, I think it was Zerbula. I'm not saying his name correctly.
Zerubbabel.
He is the one that started to rebuild the temple. They came
Right.
back from Persia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just look here real quick. Since you asked that question, Nehemiah. Nope, I'm gonna go to Ezra.
Ezra and Nehemiah were both of the same book at one time.
Yeah. The dates. Ezra. Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in 458 BC, and Zechariah was 520 BC. So 498, 520. So within that, 25 year span. So it very, very well could have been the same with Nehemiah there. So yeah.
And they walked. They walked. It took them 3 months to walk, or some of them 4 months to walk.
Right.
Yeah.
Could you imagine walking that far?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just learned that yesterday during Shabbat through El Shaddai Ministries, Pastor Mark Biltz, because he's doing a study on Ezra and Nehemiah.
Okay.
So he's gave us a quick study through it, and then he's going to go in depth starting next week.
Yeah. No, that's good. And it just brings to light some of the stuff that they've been, they had to deal with and all that. With that. So that's good. Good. So this is the time and kind of the setting here of Zechariah and where they're at. We start off here. The title here is Promising Peace. So how do we, just as a kind of introduction before we get into the scripture, how do we go about defining peace? Or how do you go about defining peace?
Well, in the most basic sense, peace is a lack of war or a lack of conflict. But the way the Bible more often talks about peace is the presence of God, kind of in you and around you that allows you to have a sense of well-being, even if everything around you is not well. And
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple different ways. Sometimes the word is shalom in Hebrew. There are a few other words that are used throughout, but there's both lack of war, but then also kind of that sense of goodwill, and those are not always the same sense depending on the writing.
Sure. Mm-hmm. How about Jim? How do you define peace?
Well, it's the absence of conflict that Jesse said. There's kind of a physical peace that you can observe, and then there's an internal peace, which is still the absence of clutter or the absence of conflict, but it's a relational. It's more of a relational aspect of peace.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at peace with your brother, if you're at peace with your neighbor, if you're at peace with God, it's more of a heart. it's more of an aspect of heart. Where's your heart at?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, peace is eating chocolate. You know, it gives you that. I agree with what Jesse said. I think it's a sense of well-being in that it's almost like a state of mind where everything is calm. I guess I was trying to get away from an absence of conflict, but I don't think you really can get away from saying it's an absence of conflict, because when you have peace, you know, it's serenity, it's you're reconciled in all your relationships. So, yeah.
But also an acceptance of what is.
I would say a heart at peace gives life to the body.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Balance. You have to have balance too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, being in the world, I mean, things that are going on in the world, if you're you have to go to God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, if you're like watching TV or doing other things, you know, that it's in the world. I mean, because we have to be in the world, but you have to go to God to get balance. So I often go to Numbers 6:24. So, and then that gives you peace. I mean, even just going into the word, you know, watching TV or anything like that, then go to the word, you know, and then that kind of balance things out with what's going on in the world, you know, or if you're on the computer, go back to the word, and that kind of balances things out. Does that make sense? And
Yeah,
that
it does,
gives you
for sure.
that gives
Mhm.
you peace.
Yeah.
I mean, that does me.
Mm-hmm.
Just balances things out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Like what you said there, as you think about peace, you know, what about, how do you find peace? Let's ask that as well. What is peace, but how do you find peace? Anyone else?
I was going to piggyback on what Debbie said, and a verse that has been special to me, because I tend to be a worrier. So Philippians 4:6, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Jesus Christ. And over the years, I go to that verse a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good. Anyone else?
Romans 15:13, the God of all hope will fill you with joy and peace as you trust in him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Good. We might come back to that here at the end, but you know, think about that. How do we go about defining peace? How do we where do we find peace? And we're going to see what that looks like here for the remnant coming back from Babylon here in Zechariah. So I'm going to go ahead and read Zechariah 8:1-8, and then 11-17. That's our scripture text here for today. And then we're going to go back in and dive into what these verses are saying. So Zechariah 8:1-8, verse 1 says this: Again, the word of the Lord Almighty came to me. This is what the Lord Almighty says: I am very jealous for Zion. I am burning with jealousy for her. This is what the Lord says: I will return to Zion and dwell in Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem will be called the city of truth, and the mountain of the Lord Almighty will be called the holy mountain. This is what the Lord Almighty says: Once again, men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each with cane in hand because of his age. The city gates will be filled with boys and girls playing there. This is what the Lord Almighty says: It may seem marvelous to the remnant of this people at that time, but will it seem marvelous to me, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what the Lord Almighty says: I will save my people from the countries of the east and the west. I will bring them back to live in Jerusalem. They will be my people, and I will be faithful and righteous to them as their God. And skipping ahead to verse 11. But now I will not deal with the remnant of this people as I did in the past, declares the Lord Almighty. The seed will grow well, the vine will yield its fruit, the ground will produce its crops, and the heavens will drop their dew. I will give all these things as an inheritance to the remnant of this people. As you have been an object of cursing among the nations, O Judah and Israel, so will I save you, and you will be a blessing. Do not be afraid, but let your hands be strong. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Just as I had determined to bring disaster upon you and showed no pity when your fathers angered me, says the Lord Almighty, so now I have determined to do good again to Jerusalem and Judah. Do not be afraid. These are the things that you are to do. Speak the truth to each other and render true and sound judgment in your courts. Do not plot evil against your neighbor, and do not love to swear falsely. I hate all of this, declares the Lord. I'm going to go back here to verse 1 in Zechariah 8. And verse 1, in my Bible, the heading here in chapter 8 says, the Lord promises to bless Jerusalem. In verse 1, we have here, it says, Zechariah writes, the word of the Lord Almighty came to me. And this phrase, Lord Almighty, is most often used here in Zechariah. It's used in other places as well, but it's primarily found right here. Just curious, what's Zechariah trying to establish here by saying the Lord Almighty? What do you think? I guess we can go back to what does Almighty mean?
I just keep thinking El Shaddai.
Mm-hmm.
Do anything.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it would suggest control, power, oversight. I don't know.
Yeah, those are all good words. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Heard it described too as the Lord, the Lord of the heavenly hosts, the angels, as what others said, full power and control.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm not an English teacher. I don't know if Almighty is, putting all and mighty together, and then you get Almighty. But that's one of the things that I look at when I see this Almighty, that you have all the might, that you're able to do. Yeah, this power, not only power to do something, but power to keep your promises. The power to you say something that it can be done. And all throughout here, especially in chapter 8, Zechariah is writing, this is the word of the Lord Almighty. And, there's a sense of, you can trust this word, right? The word of the Lord Almighty came to me. I think that holds a lot of weight. And I think that's what Zechariah is trying to put here. It's not just some words that Zechariah is saying, that he sees what's happening here and the kind of the, not lazy attitude, but maybe the unmotivated spirit of the Jews at this time, of the remnant that came back from exile. And this is not just something that he's trying to do, but this is a word that's coming from the Lord. And so he's pronouncing it. And I think that repetition, we studied why repetition is important here in the Hebrew language. This repetition that keeps coming about is trying to say, hey, this is coming from the Lord. This is what the Lord's saying. The Lord Almighty, you can trust in this word. And so as we go through that, think that through as you hear what this word is saying, and put yourself in the position of the Jewish remnant that came back here to Jerusalem. All these Jewish people, the remnant that came back that Zechariah is talking to, they were all born in captivity, and they're coming back to this land of their forefathers, of their ancestors, coming back here. Just put yourself in those shoes when you hear this, what the word of the Lord Almighty says. Verse 2.
Remember, it took them 3 or 4 months to walk back, too.
Yeah, that's right.
8 to 10 miles a day.
Mm-hmm. Through wilderness. It's not, my understanding between Babylon and Israel is not like lush green forest either. It's yeah, you were saying what, 3 or 4 months?
Well, they came from Persia. They came from Persia, not just from Babylon.
Right, which is still a wilderness. I mean, they have to go through wilderness. If you're a Jewish person and you know the history of your people and the wandering of the wilderness, that works on your mind there as well too, doesn't it? Or it should. Verse 2 here says, God is very jealous for Zion and Jerusalem. And this is one of those words here again that that we don't normally associate with a characteristic of God. One of those was that we talked about before, hate, and that's in our text here today. If you remember talking about hate, we have jealous here. There are some other words here, and so as I've said before, whenever I see words like this that are have been taught to not be jealous. Jealous is not an attribute that you should be having. And when we start seeing that then attributed to God, does anyone else here get that kind of sort of sense of a second, step back and like, whoa, what did that just say? Maybe I'm the only one there, but the term jealous here, right? How is the term jealous used? When we say we're jealous of something, what's that mean?
I see great passion here, Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe instead of saying, I am very jealous for Zion, you can say, I am very passionate for Zion. That's how I kind of look at it.
Caring for Zion?
Caring, sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're jealous, if you're jealous, you want something that somebody else has. That doesn't mean that somebody else has a right to have them. Sometimes it just means that they have them. And here, the Lord is jealous for these people because, he wants them. He doesn't necessarily have their hearts because they've given their hearts all over the place, but he wants them. And he's got that like was said, he's got that passion to have them.
Yeah.
So in this case, it can be healthy because that's where they should be. But a lot of times for us, it's more of a greed and envy kind of a thing, is how we connect.
Yeah. And along with that, and maybe Jesse or Steve or other people can talk in there, can we be jealous for something that is ours and that be a good jealous, or is there no type of jealous that we should be?
I've often heard in some older language with certain Christian marriage ceremonies, the husband and wife are jealous for each other, not because their spouse is, is flirting with someone,
property,
but because there's just like, hey, this belongs to me and I don't have it. I want it, or this belongs to me and I want to keep it. Like that's, and in some older English, that's how jealousy has been used. It's just that jealousy is a desire to have something. Again, we often talk about it as a negative, to have something that shouldn't be yours. That's not always the case historically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I looked up what jealousy means as well, and there are a bunch, as of many words, many different definitions there, and the one that came up in commentary, it also shows here as well, is this fiercely protective, which kind of comes out with some of the things that you all were saying, the caring and compassion and passion and all that. This fiercely protective. Zion, Jerusalem is a symbol of this nation of these people, and these are God's people. God made a covenant with them, and he says here, "What I am very jealous for Zion. I'm burning with jealousy for her, for being not only just this protective, but also being this caring and just this passionate there." So I think that's what that is saying there. I think this shows, the desire for God to have a restored relationship with his people as well. They've been in exile for many years and wanting to be back into this restored relationship, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. Verse 3, we have here, this is what the Lord says. Again, I will return to Zion and dwell in Jerusalem. So returning and dwelling in Jerusalem. At this time, God dwelt with his people in the in tabernacle in the wilderness, and then the temple, the first temple when it was built, and now with his second temple. And we'll see here that there's a future here, right? I will return to Zion and dwell in Jerusalem, which kind of gives us the indication that this temple has not been built yet. So the temple needs to be rebuilt. And what God is saying here is, also giving this image of, I'm going to return here to Zion, return to Jerusalem. I'm going to dwell in Jerusalem, the restoration again of God's favor on this people. He also says that Jerusalem is going to be called the city of truth. And I believe in the version in the book, it's faithful city. And here we see this practice that we see in the Bible of renaming something, right? And we see this happening with people. We see this happening with places all the time. And the significance of names and what names mean, very, very important back in this day. And so this Jerusalem is going to be renamed the faithful city, the city of truth. Again, showing that this remnant of God's people coming back are going to be faithful, and showing that God's going to keep his word here as well. The mountain of the Lord Almighty will be called the Holy Mountain. Again, renaming there. This is where the temple is going to be built. The Temple Mount was built on a mountain, Mount Moriah, which is where they believe Abraham took Isaac up to sacrifice him. This is where the first temple was at. The Temple Mount was built, which is quite interesting. If you ever have a chance to tour Israel and see some of these sites, do so. Take advantage of that. The Temple Mount, since it was on a mountain, they cut into the one side of the mountain and used that fill to put on the other side to get a flat spot for the Temple Mount, which is about 35 acres big, and that's where they built the temple. And this is where the temple is going to be rebuilt on this Temple Mount. And God says here that this mountain is going to be called the Holy Mountain. And again, renaming here and kind of setting apart that this area is going to be for God's use only and not human use. If you remember back, this area was actually a threshing floor. Back before the Temple Mount was built, it was a threshing floor, and it was for human use. And God's going to say, this is where I'm going to be dwelling, and where I'm going to be setting this holy mountain is going to be set apart for me, and not necessarily for human use. We get verse 4. Again, this is what the Lord Almighty says. And we have men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets. The city streets will be full of boys and girls playing in them. So my question to you is, what is a ripe old age?
Changes every day.
It changes every day.
My mom is 94. My mom is 94. I think that's a good ripe old age.
That's a ripe old age, isn't it? I just had to chuckle when I saw that. Ripe old age, what's that mean?
Is there a difference between a ripe old age and just an old age? What does ripe add?
Yeah, what does ripe add? Yeah. That's a good question.
Hitting our prime.
Perfectly sweet, right?
God says here. Go ahead, Susan. Yeah. We have this ripe old age, right?
It's seasoned with all kinds of experiences.
Yeah.
There you go.
What is verse 4 and 5 saying here? Right? We talked about what does peace mean and how do we experience peace. Look at what this is saying here, right? A ripe old age. How do you get to a ripe old age? There has to be the country or the area that you live has to enjoy peace of some sort. And what's that peace from? It could be from disease. It could be from war. It could be from injustice. It could be from a whole lots of things. But I think what God is showing here is, the people here, you're going to be living to a good, ripe old age. And so they're going to be sitting in the streets. It says with cane in hand because of the age. And so adding on to what a ripe old age is. But then verse 5, we have here, the city streets will be filled with boys and girls playing there. Anyone live in an area in which kids are out in the streets playing? Some people. Steve, where are you at, and how do you see that?
I live in a development which there's only one way in where in my section. So, but there's different loops and cul-de-sacs, and very often I hear kids out playing and I see them riding their bikes around the development. So,
right.
Yes, living in a development, pretty much a closed development area, the kids feel safe.
Sure.
Play.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's a great sound. I love the sound of hearing kids playing outside.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Streets filled with boys and girls playing, right? A scene of safety and justice, expression of security and stability. And I think that's what Zechariah is prophesying here, that the Lord's going to do for this area. And again, remember, this is they're coming back from exile. They walked for 4 months and had a hard life in exile in Babylon and Persia and in those areas. And this is what the Lord's going to say is going to happen here again. In verse 6, it says, this is what the Lord Almighty says. It may seem marvelous to the remnant of this people at the time, but will it seem marvelous to me, declares the Lord Almighty. What do we call this type of question?
Hypothetical.
Hypothetical. There's another term. You're right. Is this to be answered? What we call a question that's not supposed to be answered.
A rhetorical question.
Rhetorical question. There you go. A rhetorical question, right? So this is a rhetorical question. Of course, God knows the answer to this. What's the answer? Will it seem marvelous to God? No. Right? And what we get from this is this too hard for God to do, to have people live to the ripe old age and the girls and boys playing in the street and providing that peace and safety and security? No, it's not too hard. It may seem marvelous to the remnant because of all the experiences they've been going through, but it's not too marvelous for God. Verse 7. This is what the Lord Almighty says: I will save my people from the countries of the east and west. Now, of course, my mind goes right away to, well, what about the countries of the north and south? Why don't we ever hear, I'll save you from the north and south? Anyone know? Or have an idea? I mean, I have an idea, but anyone have someone explain that to them well? Because I think Jesus used the same sort of language, right? East and west. Can anyone point to me to the East Pole? Or the West Pole? Yeah, I don't think there is an East and West Pole. And I think that's why it's done that way. The North and South, there are definitive points of north. You only go north so far, and then you're not going north anymore, you're going south. And the same with south. You can only go south so far, and then you start going north. Why don't we use that language? I think that is intentional here, the East and West. You go west. What's further west of west? West, right? And you just keep on going. And so I love that imagery of the East and West, because there is no definite point of East and West. And so this East and West language encompasses everything, right? Everything. And God is saying here, I will save my people from the countries of the East and West, undoing what the exiles may have seemed as permanent, right? When the Babylonians got overthrown, I believe the Persians, there's another empire that comes about, and the exiles may think that this is permanent, but God is saying he's going to save them from any type of country that might come up. And then the last part of our first section here is verse 8. And it says this: I will bring them back to live in Jerusalem. They will be my people, and I will be faithful and righteous to them as their God. Bringing them back to Jerusalem, right, for the Jewish people and the way that they worship God at this time with sacrifices in the temple and God's presence being with them in the temple. This is total restoration and complete relationship back with God. They will be my people. It's a language that God has used before. It goes back to the covenant with Abraham, that they will be my people. And then it says here, I will be faithful and righteous to them as their God. Right? This is all happening because of God's characteristics. Restoration is happening because God is faithful and God is righteous. So we're going to hit a pause button here with this, since it's the end of this one section here. And this is all prophecy for the Jewish remnant that came back from exile. All right. This was meant to try and encourage this remnant to continue on and to keep going. This is something that was very meaningful for them. Things of happening, but has not quite yet happened. And so, as I look at this and try to think, well, what can we take from this? What are some things that we can work on for ourselves? And so these are some questions I came up with. And if there are anything else that, as we've been looking at this prophecy here, that you think can be useful for us, please speak up. But some questions here. First off, do you feel God's jealousy for you? You are God's. If you're a Christian, you are God's. Paul writes, and I don't know offhand, so someone can help me, but that you were bought with a price. Your life, your body is not your own. Do you feel God's jealousy for you? I don't know how that looks like. I don't know if you've been in a position in which you felt God really pulling at you because of going someplace you shouldn't have been going. But think about that. Yeah, how do you feel God's jealousy for you? Verses 4 and 5 talk about the extremes of the human condition, right? A place for the old and young, ripe old age, and the boys and girls playing. And in the commentary, it talked about making us look back at our own lives and how we do worship services and all that. The question comes about how have we made space for all ages at church? And how can we improve on that? You can think about our own church. You can think about the church in general, or maybe how you go about and interact with people. Have you made space for all ages at church or worship service? I'll speak for myself. I feel that our church has done a good job with the young and with the old. Maybe one sort of improvement, and I think that there's a Sunday school class or a Bible study of younger adults meeting. That age frame there is one that's always been kind of not necessarily lacking, maybe, but could see improvement. But it's just interesting. We look at the peace that God's going to afford Jerusalem and the remnant here, that the ripe old people are going to be sitting there watching the young play in the streets, and just that sense of peace and harmony that we see of all these ages coming together. I think that's good. Question number 3, right? How do we live our lives in such a way that we believe that nothing is impossible for God to do? Have you been thinking about that here over the last 8 weeks, couple months? Do we live our lives in such a way that we believe that nothing is impossible for God, or do we believe that or do we live in a way that maybe we believe that there are some things that aren't possible?
Speaks to hope and how deep and wide is our hope.
Yeah.
If there's ever a time that our hope should be clearer and stronger than ever, it's now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. For the people living here in this time frame too. They were living in exile. They had a long journey to get back. They have this initial gusto to get stuff done, and they kind of wane and they get unmotivated with that. If we if we believe that nothing is impossible for God and that God has the good for us and is always with us, I wonder how that would shape how we go about living our lives. And then the last thing here, and it's the last thing that God says here in verse 8, is that I will be faithful and righteous to them as their God. And I believe we have that same promise with us as well. And so I want you to reflect on how God has been faithful and righteous with you. And if you have a story that you want to share, I'll give you a minute here to think and share if you like. But, God's saying that I'm going to be righteous. I will be faithful and righteous to them as their God. We have that same promise in the New Testament of God being faithful and righteous with us. And so just curious, is there anything that pops up before we move on? Think about that, and maybe if there's something at the end that you want to share, do so, or tell someone. Don't just keep it to yourself, but encourage someone else with a story. Let's go to the last half of our lesson, and this is verses 11 through 17. And so in verse 11, God says, I will not deal with the remnant of this people as I did in the past. And so let's talk a little bit about how God has dealt with them, with this remnant. All right. So these are the people that came back from exile. They're in this area. They built the walls. They're not, but then they kind of lost this motivation, as I've been saying here. And there's a couple of reasons for this. They got to come back and reclaim land, which is always a stressful time. Rebuilding the walls and temple. Again, that's a hard work, especially when you have your enemies mocking you and getting all over your case. One of the interesting things here that happens, though, is where their priorities lay and where their priorities remain. The people that came back built the wall, and then they go and build their own houses while God's house lays in ruins. And that is a condemnation that you see in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Haggai of all this, of them coming back, building the walls, and then going after their own things while God's house, the temple, lays in ruins. And as part of this, God talks and speaks through Haggai that you're going to have poor harvests and you're going to have inadequate clothing during this time. All right, so this poor harvest and inadequate clothing. I don't know what the time frame here is, but this is how they've been dealing. And it may be 20, 25 years of this going on, of how God has dealt with the remnant coming back. They planted things, and yet they don't get the rain that they need, or their harvests are really poor. They have inadequate clothing, inadequate supplies. And then God says here through Zechariah in verse 11 that I will not deal with the remnant of this people as I've done before. And so this is a word of change, that there's something that's going to happen here starting out. So what's going to happen? We see in verse 12, we have the seed will grow well, the vine will yield its fruit, the ground will produce its crops, the heavens will drop their dew. We live here in eastern United States where rainfall is kind of taken for granted. We, for the most part, we have enough rain to support crops and livestock production and all that, and we don't have to do irrigation. You don't have to go too far west, in which that's not the case anymore, and especially over in this area here, rainfall is very, very important, as it is everywhere, but there are lots of dry places here as well, and that's, I think, where this heavens will drop their dew. We'll see here that the seed will grow, the vine will yield its fruit, the ground will produce its crops. And this is all, again, highlighting this piece that's going to overtake this land. You can't have a decent crop. The vine can't produce its fruit if there's a big time conflict and destruction in the land. And so this is a word here that the land itself is going to be stable. People are going to become this remnant through this word, through this prophecy, is going to start again in a relationship with God, and God's going to be blessing them. Verse 13, we have here that they have been an object of cursing among the nations, right? We have Judah and Israel, the two nations of God's people, Israel being the northern part, Judah being the southern part of this God's and the curse. So, although they claimed to belong to God, they were disloyal and followed wrong behavior. And here in this time period, if you have nations coming and taking over and taking you into exile, that's big time shame, and you must have done something wrong and all that. You've been cursed as a people, and that's why that's saying here, you've been an object of cursing among the nations, but I will save you, and you will be a blessing. And it says there, we've talked about before, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. My question is, do not be afraid of what? What have we talked about before there? What should they not be afraid of? Right? They should not be afraid of rebuilding. They should not be afraid of the nations around them that are mocking them. Maybe they should not be afraid of the discouragement that they're feeling. And then the second part there, it says, let your hands be strong. Let your hands be strong. We saw that here before with a symbolic reference to strength and ability. So God is saying here, you've been a curse, but I'm going to save you. You're going to be a blessing now. Don't be afraid. Be encouraged. Be strong. Verse 14. That's what the Lord Almighty says again. Just as I determined to bring disaster upon you and showed no pity when your fathers angered me, so now I have determined to do good against Jerusalem and Judah. 14, 15, we see God is in control. Right? This is not, exile just didn't happen. The Babylonians didn't do anything that God would have said, that God didn't have any control of that. God did have control. And, we see the first part there. Why did God determine to bring disaster upon there? Right? Their fathers, the remnant's fathers, angered him. God was angry. And then we see here in 15, God is determined to do good. And then he says again, do not be afraid. And so maybe, this continue to say, do not be afraid is, God's anger has subsided. God will not allow wrath to come back. Last week we learned that God's not going to allow the nations around them to come up against them as they're doing this rebuilding effort here. And then we have 16 and 17. And that's fine. Interesting that this here is put here at the end. It says, these are the things you are to do. So what is the remnant to do? Speak the truth to each other. Render true and sound judgment in your courts. Do not plot evil against your neighbor, and do not love to swear falsely. I hate all this, declares the Lord. We have there at the end all of this. You need to speak the truth. Render true and sound judgment, which is justice, and determined to do justice to everyone around there. Do not plot evil against your neighbor, which I don't know what that would look like at that time, but they say, do not plot evil against your neighbor. And then also, do not swear falsely. Do not bear false testimony. Do not lie. It's all those things that we could say there. God says, I hate all of this, which is very strong language and something that, if God hates something that we need to take to heart there as well. All right. So a lot there that we talked about and looking at what are some takeaways for us with this. When we were looking at verse 11, verse 11, what encouragement can we take from that verse that manifests itself in the New Testament? Anything that strike you in verse 11 that we can take here?
Well, we know that God never changes. God stays the same, but the way that he deals with people sometimes changes. And so I think that's an important point to keep in mind. We know that when Jesus came, the way that God exactly deals with people changed a little bit. Mm-hmm. And And so I see a lot of hope there. You know, God saying, hey, I'm not always going to deal with you as harshly as perhaps I did in the past, or exactly the same way. For me, it kind of keeps me on my toes. Honestly, kind of what's God going to do today? You know, it'll be good, but God doesn't often do the same thing twice. And so that's what I hear.
Good. Anyone else? Yeah, I think one of the encouragements we can take from that, going along with what Jesse said there, is, you know, there's a group of people that do not necessarily have a path to a relationship with God, and that's the Gentiles. And Jesus comes here, and we see that as kind of a almost, you know, internal conflict with the early apostles, the disciples, as they're going out after Jesus was ascended and raised into heaven. You know, there was this thing of, well, what do we do here with the Gentiles? And you know, this salvation for the Gentiles comes through Jesus as well. And so, you know, as I look at that there, I will not deal with the remnant of this people as I did in the past. You know, that change, that God can change of how he deals with people, and that we have this hope for salvation. The second thing here, we have this promise that God will be with us. We see that in Matthew 28 when he sends the disciples out, apostles out with the Great Commission, and he says that he'll be with us. And we see that in different pieces throughout the New Testament. God in this prophecy through Zechariah says twice to do not be afraid. And you know, I think it's important for us to reflect on how can we live not afraid. You know, have you heard God speaking to you and saying, do not be afraid? I think it comes back to what we've been talking about here. Some people brought up, you know, always going back to the Word. And what does the Word say? And what promises and hope can we get from the Word? And if we have that, we don't need to be afraid. I think it's very powerful. And the last thing here, is there anything in the list of verses 16 and 17 that does not apply to us today? Again, this is the prophecy to the remnant of Israel. And I'm just curious, as you look over those four things in 16 and 17, is there anything that does not apply to us today?
Can we go back to verse 12?
You bet.
Verse 12, it said the seed will grow well and the vine will yield its fruit. Well, the vine is Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says what, John?
I'm not sure exactly where
15.
it is, but he is the vine.
Yeah,
And
I like that.
And we are the fruit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we don't have to be afraid.
Right.
Even
right.
in today with the COVID
Mm-hmm.
and the invisible enemy that's out there ramping around.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
that's why I keep going back to the Word, because I mean, I don't watch the news, but Greg watches the news all the time. So I get my news from Greg. But I'm on the computer, but not all the time. But I get all this other strange news, and I'm watching really weird stuff. And so I have to go back to the Word, because I'm watching stuff that I did not realize that's going on in the world now, that's sickening, that I thought was over and done with, but it's been going on since the beginning of time. And, you know, and I cried about it, but I go back to the Word and I see God says, don't pray for these people. And so that helps me. So, because it's an invisible enemy. God says, put on your armor. So we got to put on our armor every day. And, but he's the vine and we're the fruit. And we just have to keep on sharing the message, you know, with people, and let him do the work.
Yeah.
So, and don't be afraid.
Right.
And just keep standing up. I think 12 is a really good verse that's in here.
Yeah, yeah. I like that.
It's like it's in code, but it's not really in code if you know what the word is.
Yeah, if you know what Jesus talked about, right?
Yeah.
Look at those four attributes there. You know, I don't think there's anything there that doesn't apply to us today, and so I think that's an encouragement to us in 16 and 17. You know, if there's one there, you know, a challenge, and look at that. Which one of those do you need to work on? Speaking the truth to each other, rendering justice, not plotting evil against your neighbor, or, you know, not lying. Or swearing falsely. I don't know if there's anything that speaks to you there or not, but I think that's, you know, for us in Sunday school today, something that we can take a look at and see if we can work on one of those.
Mm-hmm.
So that comes to an end of our lesson. And so in conclusion, you know, God showed ways here that he was going to give peace and prosperity to the remnant that came back from exile. And so for us, you know, we need to be in the Word. We need to be looking at what God has talked to us in the New Testament there, because that's how God shows us peace today, right? How do we have peace, and the way that the ways that you define peace and the ways that God defined peace? How does God show us peace today? And you know, make sure that you are reading and getting in there and seeing what God's peace actually has to say there. That's all I have here. I don't know if there's any other final comments or questions, or hear from Zechariah. I thank everyone for joining in here, and continuing on. And Steve, would you lead us in closing word of prayer?